All right, y'all. We did it. Sorry, guys. We're late. We had some technical difficulties. And thanks to our guest, Christian, she has saved the day. For some reason, our Zoom connections were not adequate. And so Christian saved the day for us tonight. But welcome, everybody. We are joined today with Christian Brooks and, of course, my co-host and partner in crime, Destiny. We are really happy you are here viewing and joining us tonight to talk about voter suppression and COVID-19. My name is Lee Cato, and I am the managing editor of Unbound. And my dear co-host, I'll let her introduce herself.
Thank you, Lee. My name is Destiny Hodges, and I'm the associate for Young Adult Volunteer Program. And we are just excited that you tuned into our 6th mini episode or series with COVID-19 to provide this space for young adults to come and hear from young adults around issues that are going on around COVID-19. I'm excited because we have our girl Christian Brooks in the house, another fellow employee of the Presbyterian Church, U.S.A, but also a millennial, young adult. So yeah, I'm excited to hear what message she has to bestow on us tonight around voter suppression. So Lee, I guess I'll kick off the first question if you don't have anything else to add.
You go for it.
All right. First, I guess before we get into diving deep into the subject matter, Christian, do you want to just tell everyone who you are and a little bit about what you do? And then following that, can you explain voter suppression so that way we are all on the same equal footing about what voter suppression is before we dive deep into the content?
Yeah, definitely. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity to be here and speak with you guys, and also just be in a young adult space. So thank you so much for that. As you guys have already mentioned, my name is Christian Brooks. I'm the Associate for Domestic Issues in the Office of Public Witness, which is the public policy and advocacy office for the Presbyterian Church, U.S.A. So I have a pretty wide portfolio. I have all of the domestic issues. So anything from voter suppression, education, immigration, food security, all of that is under me. So if you have any questions about it or what PCUSA policy is, what we are doing at the congressional level, then feel free to email me at my first name my last name at pcusa.org. But as far as voter suppression, so voter suppression is using tactics to discourage or prevent someone who has the right to vote from voting. So voter suppression was really created as a way to stop African Americans or Black Americans from voting after the 15th Amendment was passed. It's how states got around Black people voting. So we know that after the 14th and the 15th Amendment were passed during the Reconstruction era, there were a lot of Black men who were registered to vote. There were Black men who held seats in Congress. There were Black men who were elected officials within local government. But once the Federalist troops were pulled out of the South, that's when what we know as the Jim Crow South came about. And during the Jim Crow era, there were different tactics that were used, both legal and illegal, as a means to stop Black folks from voting and stop Black folks from exercising their voice and having that level of power.
Yeah, and I think that's a great introduction to what we're going to be talking about, because I think it's important, specifically us being in an election year and us being in a moment in time where we are dealing with the impacts of COVID-19 and how that's going to change of our lives, how it's a new normal is down the road. And I'm wondering, in your experience and in the work that you do, how have you seen voter suppression manifest in the past, but also how you have seen it happen now in the midst of this virus?
Yeah. So voter suppression has been going on for a long time, right? So if we, if people have seen the movie Selma, then we can recall the tactics that were used in the movie, like the literacy tests and paying poll taxes. So literacy tests were anywhere from 100 questions, and you had to answer all of the questions in 1 to 5 minutes, something that nobody would be able to do, or charging extremely high poll taxes to people of color, particularly African Americans, in order to vote. Now, and we had the fight for the Voting Rights Act, and the Voting Rights Act was passed. However, in 2013, the Supreme Court cast down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, and Section 5 is the pre-clearance section. So basically, the way that it's set up is there is a formula that determines the states that have to go through pre-clearance before they can pass a voting law. So these are states that have historically had issues of voter suppression. However, it was deemed that the formula that was being used was out of date and therefore unconstitutional. So that formula was cast down. So when the formula is cast down, well, how do we now determine which states have to go through pre-clearance? So it just made the pre-clearance section basically enforceable. So we saw after the 2013 decision, we saw a lot of voter suppression tactics coming up. Earlier, I was talking to you, Destiny and Lee, about something that was in the recent news. In Kansas in 2013, they passed a law stating that you had to show proof of citizenship in order to vote. Now, thankfully, federal appeals court recently cast that down last week or a couple weeks ago. But, just thinking about the documents that you have to have when you are showing proof of citizenship. So it's either a passport or a birth certificate. Well, let's think about a passport. A passport costs upwards of $100 in order to get one. How many people in low-income neighborhoods do you know have $100 sitting around where they can go and get a passport? That's number one. Number two, if you don't have $100 sitting around for a passport, what do you even need a passport for, right? That's number one. But number two, birth certificates. So typically when people live in low income neighborhoods, they move around a lot and important documents get lost in the moving and things of that sort. So those aren't things that are always readily available. So it is a way of suppressing a vote. And then also the different ID laws requiring these IDs in order to vote. Now, there are some states where you can vote with your student ID, but there are some states that are very strict and you have to have a government issued ID. And this is an issue for a lot of people because IDs are not cheap. When I moved to DC, I had to switch my ID from a Pennsylvania ID. The DC ID was almost $50. I started to not get one. However, I needed to register my car and I needed to register to vote. So I just paid the $47.50 that I had to pay for my ID. But how many people have $47 laying around just to buy an ID? That's number one. Number two, why is an ID $47? That is a conversation for a different day. But so these are different issues that we have seen that we have seen just in the past. Now, bringing it to today and the COVID-19 pandemic, I think that Wisconsin is a great example of what will happen if we don't get our stuff together for the November election. Because in Wisconsin, first of all, we know that Milwaukee is an epicenter for Black and Brown folks being infected and dying of COVID-19. So there is a big big health risk and health scares for people who are in Wisconsin, Milwaukee in particular. So, you know, there is that level of, okay, do I want to go and stand in these long lines to vote and put my health at risk? But also in Milwaukee in particular, there were I think about 180 or throughout the state, rather, there were about 180 polling stations. No, Milwaukee, 180. They went down to 5.
Wow.
So to have that many polling stations and only go down to that few, we know that, you know, the people who decide not to vote absentee, they're going to have to stand in these astronomically long lines. That's number one. But number two, let's think about transportation, right? Because if there are only 5 polling locations, then people have to get to those polling locations. So people who are probably already having issues with transportation, now transportation is going to be even more of an issue. That's number one. Number two, let's think about the time that it takes to stand in a long line to vote. People were standing in line for like 3 or 4 hours. Well, there are people who, one, they can't take that time off of work, because we know a lot of people of color are essential workers. So let's say they're working from 9 to 5. So they either have to go before work or after work. So if they're they can't necessarily go through that 9 to 5 window, because that 3 or 4 hours off work, that could be a bill that doesn't get paid. But then also, you know, we had the issue of the mail-in ballots, right? The absentee ballots, where there were thousands of people in Milwaukee who are in Wisconsin who requested absentee ballots and did not receive them. And the people who did receive them, there were a number of the absentee ballots that were postmarked too late to be counted. So there were a lot of issues going on within Wisconsin, and the people who were standing in lines waiting to vote. There's information coming out now that there are that a number of them are coming down with the virus. So they're not sure if it is connected to standing in line for voting, but those are the only things that those people have in common at this point. So just a lot of issues going on that are going to affect voting. And a lot of these issues we were seeing beforehand. So for example, closing polling stations has been a voter suppression tactic for years. So now that polling stations are being closed for a legitimate reason, because to stop the spread of the virus, the voter suppression is going to continue. So it's a deep issue that has been going on for a very long time and has to be addressed.
Thank you, Christian. Yeah, I didn't even know about the issue that was going on in Milwaukee. Just being someone who takes voting very seriously, being an African-American woman, knowing our history, how much our ancestors fought for us to have the right to vote, and knowing that a lot of people just don't take that voice for granted. They don't exercise their right to vote. And just seeing, just even before COVID-19, the lack of regard for voting and exercising your right to vote gets my blood boiling. And then hearing you say this, I'm just like taking deep breaths. So yeah, just trying to be centered right now before I ask your next question. But so you named some of the challenges that people might have to go through, you know, with transportation being a big issue, going from 180 polling places down to 5, like really? And it's probably in communities that they probably use public transportation and relying on it. Now we know it's unsafe to take public transportation because even bus drivers, cab drivers, Uber drivers are catching the virus because of the circulation of the amount of people they come in contact with. So people are scared to get on these public modes of transportation. What are some of the efforts that can be done to ensure that we have, I wouldn't say higher voter turnout. I'm not optimistic on that regard. I'm not. But just that we keep it steady or have voter engagement. Like, what are some options that we can do as a person or activist, advocates, and also what can your local government do to ensure that we have successful voter turnout? I know in Harrisburg, Dauphin County, they were proactive and mailed everyone 2 forms of absentee ballots requests. Like, so that's one thing, but what can we do as the people to ensure that we have turnout this year?
Yeah. So, I think that we can do a few things. One is advocate for polling stations in low income neighborhoods where that people don't have readily available access to personal modes of transportation. Make sure those polling stations stay open, because those of us who have access to cars and things of that sort, we can be a little more flexible. So, for example, my normal polling station is down the street from my house. I walk my dog past that school every day. However, that polling station is going to be closed, and I'll have to go somewhere else if I vote in person and not by absentee ballot on June 2nd in our primary election. But I have a car, so I can get in my car and drive somewhere else. But someone who does not have a car doesn't have that flexibility. So if you are aware of neighborhoods where there aren't a lot of people with cars, buses aren't running as regularly, make sure that those polling stations stay open. We have to make it as easy as possible, or take away all of the different barriers that are put in place. Because I think that one thing that this virus is revealing is that there are those of us who have the flexibility to change, and there are those of us who don't. So if you have the flexibility to change, then be willing to do so. For those who don't, that's number one. Number two, information. Making sure that people have information. One of the most effective ways to oppress a group of people is to take away their access to information. Information is power. Make sure that people know that they can vote absentee ballot. That's number one. Where can they get it? So DC sent out these forms. So this is a form that tells us where we can get our absentee ballot, how to send it in. It also tells us if we're not voting absentee, then these are the different polling locations that are open. So number one, voting absentee, where can people get their absentee ballot? How can they send it in? And then helping people to fill it out. Don't necessarily help them. Don't tell them who to vote for, although I know that's tempting. But help them to fill it out, because it's not always forms are not always written in a way for everybody to understand it. So helping people fill out their forms, that's number one. But number two, making sure that if people are voting in person, that they know where to vote. Because like I mentioned before, my regular polling station is not open. So where do I go? Make sure that people know that information. And then also with the mail-in forms, stay on top of it. When people are mailing in their forms, you can track to make sure that your absentee ballot has been received. So for DC residents, we can check on the DC Board of Elections website to see if our absentee ballot has been received, or we can call in to see if our absentee ballot has received. Figure out where their place is that you need to call, or where their website is that you need to go to track your absentee ballot, and make sure that it is in the system. And if it's not in the system, Call some friends that you know who've sent in absentee ballots as well. And if theirs aren't in the system either, there might be a larger issue going on. And if you deem that there's something shady going on, call the news. I'm a big proponent of calling the news. Call the news and let them know what's going on so that you can get your word, so you can get the word out there, and so that your voice can be heard.
Call it out.
Yeah.
Call the press. Don't lie. I'm a big proponent of that too.
Yeah, because you know what? One thing that corruption does not like is a spotlight.
Right.
So spotlight it. Call the news.
Expose them.
Yeah, call it out. I mean, yeah, and that's another. And I also wonder, with all, I mean, for us, hearing all these facts and hearing all the experiences that people have with not being able to vote, having to have an ID, all these things that are used to suppress people's right to vote, and I automatically think about the people who don't buy it, who don't buy that voter suppression is real, that it is intentional, that it is an intentional act of white supremacy to silence the voices of people of color, and to really, I want whoever's listening to this to drill it in about the intentionality behind all this. Like, this is not just, we're just going to close things because of this, like the intentionality behind it. And I wonder, how do we really get it across that this is real? And I know some people are lost cause, but for those who really want to understand, and I'm talking about white people, to know that this is intentional and that these things are done for a reason, and how intricate and detailed it is to pull this off, to really suppress people. Yeah, and I don't even know the answer to that, but it is something that I think about, because people will deny it. And we were talking about this earlier. People will say that is not real. Yeah.
Look, I know this is a Christian show, but look, I'm gonna chime in on that one, Lee. I think, like what you're doing right now, you're calling it out. It's one thing for Christian not to say it as women of color, but for a white male to say it, even, white women can say it too, but for a white male to say it, it holds so much more prominence and value. So white men are known to listen to other white men. So just by advocates who are white, sticking up and proclaiming what is going on in the system and the injustices is one way that people will listen. Because like I said, we can scream it from the top of our lungs. We've been screaming it,
Right.
And things are still the same. And I'm gonna put a plug in for Christian in the U.S.A program. That's why, it's so important to engage with Young Adult Volunteer Program. The majority of our people that we mentor and who engage in the U.S.A year are white people, and starting to shift white men. And it's important that their way of thinking and their processing is of a broad perspective, so that way they can be advocates and they can go out into the world and speak truth to light.
Yeah,
turn it back over to Christian.
I completely agree with that, Destiny, because far too often, when we say it as Black people, as people of color, and as women, we are seen as, well, you're just complaining. You are just complaining. You're just making up excuses. But when a white person says it, especially a white male, then it has to be true. It has to be facts. And that bothers me to the depths of my soul that people are like that, but it is the reality. And I completely agree. That's why we need allies who are aware of this issue to speak up, because unfortunately there is that audience who they won't hear it coming from me, but they'll hear it coming from someone who looks like them. That's number one. But number two, honestly, there are some people who won't get it until they experience it.
Right.
And unfortunately, some of them will never experience it. So that goes back to privilege, right? You have the privilege to turn a blind eye, so you do so. So there is a certain level of education that has to happen, but there's also a certain level of intentionality that has to happen. You have to intentionally step out of your privileged bubble to be able to see life in somebody else's shoes. And unfortunately, everybody is not able to do that. Now, I am the eternal optimist, and I think that there are a lot of people who are willing to do so. So I focus my time and attention on the people who are. And as you said, Lee, some people I just kind of chalk up to a lost cause. But having those allies, and then having the different educational resources out there. So I was talking to you all earlier today about a video called Suppress, the Fight to Vote, and it's about the gubernatorial election in 2018 in Georgia, and all of the things that were happening then. Students who couldn't vote, the Black and brown folks who couldn't vote, low income people who couldn't vote. Like there just a laundry list of voter suppression tactics that were used during that election. So going on there and watching that, and really educating yourself on what is actually happening, and being able to sit down and listen to people, because sometimes you don't know, right? Sometimes you don't know until you hear somebody else say it, because as I mentioned before about the IDs, it could, like, some people could say, hey, it's just an ID, so what? Well, IDs cost money, and IDs aren't cheap. And until you listen to someone say, I don't have $50 to spend on an ID because I need to pay my bills, then you don't think about it from that perspective.
Yeah. And if you were in a position where you never had $50 to spend on something, you're never gonna be able to connect with that.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a sad reality that people have to experience something, and so much so that that is the only way they understand it. That we cannot take people at their word. We cannot hear people's experiences and say that is true, that is how they are experiencing it. It is an unfortunate reality that people have to experience it themselves for it to be true. And I hope that in some way white people can really hear that and say, these things are true. You may not be experiencing it, because you're not experiencing it does not mean that it does not exist. And the fact that a lot of these things, yeah, people have no idea. I remember when being educated in South Carolina, which we are in the lowest low in South Carolina when it comes to public education, and had no idea these things existed, because we were not taught it, probably on purpose. And if we were taught it, we were taught it in a way that kind of whitewashed it. And so people aren't getting the history correctly. We aren't getting how voter suppression and other manifestations of racism even began. We grew up with the lost cause narrative, and so I hope that seeing these things and hearing us talk, that we can somewhat move forward in a way that people shouldn't have to experience it in order for us to get it.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's what I hope in that.
And Lee, we were talking about the theological implications, and
Right.
bringing this back to religion, right? a lot of people experiencing these issues, not just voter suppression, food insecurity, housing insecurity, they're sitting in our congregations.
Yeah.
So having a conversation with the person sitting next to you is important to find out about these issues, because these things are not as far away from home as narratives like to paint that they are. So, as we are kind of thinking about this theologically, first of all, everyone has inherent worth and dignity. Everyone has a right to have their voices heard. That is number one. Number two, if we are called to love our neighbor as ourselves, then we are also called to advocate for our neighbor. There are issues that affect our neighbors. They may not affect us, but they affect our neighbor, and we have a duty to speak out against those issues. We have a duty to make sure that the people that we say that we care about, the people that we say we're shepherding, the people that we say we're supporting, we have a duty to make sure their needs are met. That means making sure that they have a right to exercise their vote in the elections, making sure that they have access to affordable housing, making sure that people have access to food, making sure that people have access to a livable wage. We have got to stop with this surface level understanding of what it means to love thy neighbor. We have to stop with that. Loving someone also means doing something about the issues that impact them. You love me so much, but I don't have anywhere to go.
Right.
What is your love going to do for me?
Yeah.
So, I mean, honestly, we have to start speaking to the depths of people. We have to start speaking to the souls of people and addressing the issues that they are addressing the issues that they're going through. And if one of those issues is not being able to express their vote, then we have to speak out against that. That's number one. But number two, we have a duty to exercise our vote. And we have a duty to exercise our vote because our elected officials are the people who are making these laws. Our elected officials are the people who are making decisions about programs like SNAP. They're making decisions about HUD programs or food or housing security programs, health care. They're making these decisions, and we have a duty to make sure that we are putting people in these positions who are going to take care of our neighbors, who are going to put resources in place so that we're all able to live a quality life.
Christians preaching.
Yes, you basically dove right into the question I was going to ask about our call to action as people of faith. And then you went on to my other question about, okay, well, please talk about how, this affects you locally. You preached about that. So I was like, okay, to my next one. But what I would like to hear, because I know that OPW, and for you non-presbys, that's Office of Public Witness, is doing other interesting work around voter suppression and voter rights. Do you want to uplift any of the work that you're doing currently, webinar series, hint, or any fun resources that might help others to learn more about all of the topics you were discussing today that don't have the breadth of knowledge that you have?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a couple of years ago, OPW put together a toolkit, and this toolkit is about voter suppression. So it's talking about the 2013 Supreme Court decision. It's talking about what is voter suppression, where did it come from, why it's an issue, and it's really an educational tool for church groups, for sermons, and things of that sort. So you can really dive into the issue of voter suppression and educate yourselves on what it is, why we have to fight against it. There are also some resources on how to fight against it. That's number one. But number two, as Destiny mentioned, right now we're going through a discussion series. The Office of Public Witness, as well as other offices within the Presbyterian Church, we're going through a discussion series where we are talking about the coronavirus and the impact that it has had on different racial groups. So we had one yesterday. Our first discussion was yesterday, and it was about how the coronavirus has impacted the Black community. And we had someone from Brightmoor Food Pantry in Detroit come on, and someone who was representing the Black immigrant community in the Northeast. And they gave us a lot of information about what's going on. The fact that, there was a moratorium passed on shutting off water in Detroit. The governor passed a moratorium, but it hasn't been enforced. So right now, people's water is still being cut off. And right now we're in the midst of a pandemic where the only way that you fight against it is to wash your hands. And also the way that you nurse yourself back to health is to stay hydrated, and people don't have water. So, we have to uplift those issues, first of all, bring light to those issues, and also fight against it. Call the governor of Michigan and letting them know we not only need a moratorium, we need an enforceable moratorium. And I think this goes to a conversation that I have been having with a couple of different people about policy. Policy is not the solution. Policy is an avenue to get to the solution. It's a tool. It's a tool that we are using to lift up people. But just like having a policy pass and washing our hands of it, that webinar was an example of how that is not the case, because this policy was passed, but it's not being enforced. We have to make sure these things are being enforced. That's number one. But number two, we have to make sure that these policies are helping the people who need help. We have to make sure that they're getting to the people who the vote is being suppressed, the people who water is being shut off, the people who are without access to food. We have to make sure that we are putting people first and uplifting people and using policy as an avenue to uplift people. But as far as resources, Lift Every Voice, that's our toolkit. But also tune in for the webinar series. The first video is on our Facebook page at PC-USA Washington. It's on our Facebook page. Go and check that out. There is another episode within the discussion series that will be occurring next Monday. The Presbyterian Self-Development of People and Racial Equity Office will be talking about anti-Asian racism that has been going on since this pandemic started. So that'll be on May 18th at 12:30. So just tune in, continue to educate yourself, sign up for our action alerts. We are sending out a lot of action alerts. Also, take the census. Those of you who have not taken the census, take the census. Tell somebody else to take the census, because the census and voting is very much intertwined. The census count is used to determine congressional districts. So it is very important that people are counted. So make sure you're taking the census, make sure that your neighbors are taking the census, and you're sending as much information about the census out as you can.
Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'm really glad you said that about policy. And in many ways, this is also not only speaking to the policy of this country, but also denominationally within churches, there are policies as well, which is where I work under in my day job. But I'm really glad you said that about just because we make a statement, just because we have this overarching policy that we are supposed to be abiding by, does not necessarily mean that is the reality. And the follow through is, and it's almost, and I kind of say it when President Obama was elected, when we said, oh, we're over the racism thing. We elected our first Black president, and it was like a check mark in some ways. But in the reality is, the reason why we have the administration we have now is because there was no work being done in it. Like, there was no follow through. There was no, well, let's really do get down to the work of deconstructing racism and realizing what that really means. And so I'm really glad you said that. Because yeah, in many ways, policy is just, yeah, it means nothing if we don't follow through with it. Yeah, and I also wonder, since this is a young adult gathering, and in some ways, in hoping that younger people will vote, that has not been the case in some ways. But what can young people do now to really, as we look forward to the election in November, God help us in that process. But what can we, as young people, what is something you think we can do? Yeah, what can we do as young people?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that lately, especially since the pandemic has started. We have this there are those of us who are privileged enough to have time at home. And I've really been thinking about the issues that are going on and what can we do. And I think that on a short-term level, we need to make sure we are telling people to vote in this election. This election is important. We there's some stuff that I can't say on the work platform that I could say if I was in my house by myself with my friends or something. So I'm not gonna say it, but we need to vote in the election in November. Votes, tell your friends to vote. And also, I think that young adults have a very unique platform with social media that our parents don't necessarily have, and our parents' don't necessarily have. So we can utilize this to our advantage. The video that I was telling you all about, Suppress the Fight to Vote, there is a young woman in there, and she was able to kind of get out the information about not receiving her absentee ballot. She did that via Facebook. So she contacted a few friends and asked them, and they said no, and put a post on Facebook. It went viral, and found out that there were thousands of people who this issue was happening to. So using social media to, one, encourage people to vote, but two, if something is happening, lift it up. Tell the news, and also lift it up on social media, because something will go viral on social media within like an hour. Within an hour, you can have 10,000 hits. So, using the different platforms that we are aware of, but also making sure that we are doing what we need to do to help older generations exercise their right to vote. As I mentioned before, helping someone fill out an absentee ballot. I think that so DC sent out this guide, this voting guide, and in here there is an application for an absentee ballot. But I mean, these things aren't always as straightforward as they should be. You have all this information, and then you turn the page and you have all of this as well. Now, if my grandmother was filling this out, she couldn't even see this. So I would really have to kind of sit here and help her fill that out. So, I mean, let's do that, helping the older generations who aren't as tech savvy, who don't necessarily know all of this, pay it forward and help them out. But on the long term end, we need systemic change. We need long-term, sustainable change. The reason why all of these issues have been spotlighted because of COVID-19 or the coronavirus, especially amongst people of color, is because of systemic racism. This stuff has been going on long before coronavirus. And if we don't do anything, it'll be here long after coronavirus. Voter suppression was going on before. Black and brown folks dying at high rates of illnesses, of preventable illnesses, was going on before. So we have to address the issue of systemic racism and start interrogating things on a deeper level. Why is it that that Black and brown folks are have a higher risk of dying? Why is it that Black and brown folks are exposed to these different health conditions such as asthma, diabetes, cancer? Like, what's going on? And really thinking deeper about these issues and seeking to do something about root causes, because I think that as a church, we are very, very good at relief. We are very, very good at relief. We are very good at playing some defensive work or playing a defensive game. We do not play a lot of offense. We do not strategize a lot. We don't throw the first punch a lot. But that's what we're going to need in order to move the needle. That is what we're going to need in order to change systems. We are going to have to take a step forward and dismantle these systems that are causing these issues to go on in the first place. And I believe that my generation, I believe in the millennials. You know, I know we get a lot of heat, but I believe in us.
We do. We get a lot of heat.
We get a lot of heat. You know what? Some of it, don't get me wrong, some of it is warranted, but a lot of it is not.
Right.
9 times out of 10, I'm with us millennials. I'm like, nah, that ain't us. But on this one right here, nah, y'all gonna catch the flack from me because we are the biggest voting bloc. There's no reason why we should not swing any election that is on the planet. And yet we millennials, not we, us three, because we vote, we fail to come out. Yeah. And just to add, not only is the November election important, but there's still time in some places to vote for your local election.
Right.
All those systemic issues that Christian just named, 9 times out of 10, they go on locally.
Yep. Yeah.
I mean, it trickles down from the government, but it's your state, in your city, in your borough representatives who are the ones that are oppressing you the most. And Absolutely. You don't even know it, but it's the local election. So and also voting to the November election, check and see if you can still send in your absentee ballot for the primary as well, because that's important. Those are the changes that you see. Those are the changes that affect you. Those are changes that are going to be the ones to, like Christian said, push that needle over. So that's my little rant. But millennials, y'all need to vote. We're too large of a voting bloc not to.
Vote. And these local elections, that's where the stories aren't being told. Mm-hmm. Because people know people. People know Uncle Joe, who's been running for state office for 35 years, and they're not going to say anything against Uncle Joe. I mean, it is a communal thing that happens. I saw it like local elections where I'm from. The same people run, the same people get elected, and they do the same things. Nobody calls them out. And that is where the local people who are running and people who are in small cities, rural towns, smallish cities need to speak up, because that is where a lot of people are feeling the effect. And there's some crazy stuff going on in Tennessee, and people would never realize it. Yeah, because people don't speak out against it. Because all the higher up elections get all the clout, but it are these local elections that do matter a lot.
Christian pointed to that earlier about Milwaukee.
Yeah.
That's a local election decision.
That is exactly right. And I'm so glad that y'all brought that up, because it's the local elections. The local policy will affect you much quicker than national policy, and it will have a much graver effect. Your local and state And, you know, those are the elections that we like really need to pay attention to, because they fly under the radar so much, because there's so much hype around the presidential election. Not to say that the presidential election isn't important, but because it is, but state and local elections are extremely, extremely important. Who's going to be your representative in both the U.S. House of Representatives and in your state House of Representatives? Your state and local election, you vote for the superintendents. Like these are people running schools. Like we have to pay more attention to our local elections. But then this also comes back to information, right? Because that information is not being shared with people in like low income neighborhoods. Oh, well, such and such so-and-so is running for the Pennsylvania House of Representatives or blah, 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 blah. That information isn't being readily told to those people. So if you know, you go tell them, right? Let them know about these different things, because, you know, I remember my first time voting in a presidential election. I didn't realize everybody else that I had to vote for. I did not think about all of the other people that I had to vote for, because there was so much attention paid to the presidential election, and all of the local people that I also had to vote for just kind of flew under the radar. So 18-year-old Christian does not know who she voted for at that point. She knows she voted for Obama, though.
Yeah, same. Because that was the first presidential election I voted in. Yeah. But then also you see all these people running, they're running unopposed.
Yeah.
And I think that's also something else, is that how do we empower people to say, you can do this? Like we see the gifts in people, or we see people who we think would be an agent of change. It's empowering those people to do so, because these people run unopposed. Nobody runs against them because they think they're going to lose. And at least in Tennessee, that's what happens a lot. And so, yeah, I wonder about that too. Like, how do we empower people and run for office? And also, but that's also another conversation about campaigning and the money that goes into it, which is a whole nother suppression, oppression, that you can't afford to run, for one. It's so expensive. So I think, yeah, it's just a whole system that just is run off of just a lot of oppressive motives. Yeah.
I don't want to segue too far from the point of convo tonight, but just to answer, or to chime in about your question, Lee, that you threw up, like encouraging people to run and how it's so expensive to run. When I ran for school board, I think I spent like $3,000.
Mm-hmm.
When I ran for city council, I spent $2,000. But what Christian was saying earlier, what made my campaign so successful was taking advantage of those social media platforms that we millennials know how to use.
Yeah.
Two, if you're born and raised in your state or your county or your city, it makes it that much easier, because those are your neighbors. They know you. You played, down the street with Uncle Joe's kid. You ran track with, Mary Sue's whoever. So my message is, being a elected official, having to give all that up to come work for the church. It's just go for it. And if you fail, oh well, at least you try, because no one else is doing anything. They're sitting on their butts complaining and not being change advocates. Get people, talk to other local officials. You'll be surprised of much, unless you're running against them, then they probably won't want to talk to you. But people are willing to help young people run for office. I'll help you if you're really interested. Reach out to me. I'll take you all the way through from just getting your petition to your voter party when you win. How to have a good turn up. So reach out to us. There's people who are willing to support you if that's what you really want to do. So I don't want you to feel discouraged because you don't have the money, because I am a person of faith, and I believe if God wants you there, he'll put you there. So therefore, you go do it.
You better say that. And you know what? Also, I found that there could be a sense of imposter syndrome, right?
Mhm.
Just because I'm young, then I can't do this. Because I'm young, there are people who know so much more than
Mhm.
I do. Don't let that stop you.
Right.
If this is something that you want to do, if you want to run for an elected position, run. Because you know what? I have sat in rooms where
Some
people
dummies.
were years older than me. I mean, years older than me. And the things that they did not know, I was flabbergasted. And so you have value to bring to the table. And it's so funny that this has turned into a conversation where we're encouraging somebody to run for office. But whoever you are who decides to run for office, please contact us to let us know that we were speaking to you today.
Yes.
and run.
Yeah.
Don't think I don't know what's going on. I don't know enough. I don't know. Because you know what? There are a lot of people in these elected positions who don't know anything either. So
Yeah. And I think the age thing is important. And I think, and that's intentional too, is that if you're young, you don't know things. And we have been talking about this, well, in the span of, and this does apply for young adults, and that we're told we're young, which means we are unexperienced in many people's eyes. And I think that our generation has seen so much in such a small amount of time. And what we're going through now, our experiences as a very different people, even on this call, just our lives in general.
Mhm.
And yeah, I have also been in rooms where people have been doing things for years and still don't have a clue about what's going on. But I think that is an important issue to raise, is that your age, that you are young, should never stop you from doing something, because we have experience and we have knowledge and we have gifts that other people don't. But yeah, if you got the idea, we're gonna need some credit.
Yeah, please let us know.
Yeah, whoever decides. Well, Christian, this was wonderful.
Yes.
And I'm so glad that we got to have this conversation, because I think in an election year and in this moment, it is very important for us to do everything we can to make sure people's voices are heard. And I hope that people are inspired to help people fill out absentee ballots, to educate their neighbors about what's going on, to vote yourself. Whoever's listening to this, we hope that you vote. And if you're not registered, it's very easy to do. Get registered to vote. We don't care who you vote for. And that is me saying that on a professional level. As the church, we can talk later in a non-professional setting. Yeah, as Christian said, but we hope that this was very helpful for you, for whoever's listening, and we'll continue to do the work to fight against these oppressions that are happening right now. But thank you, Christian, for the work that you do. You are a gift to us, definitely. And Destiny, you're just so special.
Yeah, awesome.
What kind of special? No, I'm just
Right. Special is always good.
I was like, I don't think it was special.
Yeah. I feel very blessed to be in both of your presence and get
Okay,
to
I
work
like
with
that.
y'all.
Blessed. I'm a blessing.
Yeah, to get to work with each one of you. So I am very, very blessed in that. So
Seemly.
so thank you, Christian. Thank you, Destiny. And until next time, friends, we'll be back next week.
Well, thank you all too. Thank you for having me. Thank you to everybody who tuned in. And if you decide to run, let us know so we know that we impacted somebody.
We can feel it.